Early in the 9th century, a small abbey built on the site of a former hermitage in the wilds of the Aveyron region of France was on the decline. In 866, the abbey stole, according to the chronicler, the relics of a young virgin martyred in the 3rd century, Sainte Foy. And miraculously, thanks to the saint, the little abbey lost in the middle of nowhere began to prosper. The holy martyrs, represented by their relics, served to intercede between God and the faithful. Their miracles intervened in every phase of daily life. They healed the sick, made the lame walk, protected the harvests, and guaranteed truces and treaties. And in exchange, they were venerated, just like some said, pagan idols. Sainte Foy, who was reputed to give back sight to the blind and freedom to prisoners, was very successful. Pilgrims flocked to Conques, and soon the ancient abbey church was too small. A new one was needed, bigger and more beautiful, both to honour the saint and to hold the crowds of her supplicants. This was a new type of church, known as a pilgrim church, of which Conques was a prototype. The monks at Conques who began to build their new church were part of the great architectural renaissance of the 11th century, that much later came to be known as the Romanesque style, in other words, like the Romans. These great Romanesque churches built all over the West are communal endeavours, but only the names of the bishops, canons or abbots are remembered. They say that the work at Conques started under Abbot Ulderic in about 1050 and was still not finished at the death of Abbot Bégon towards 1107. There is no known architect, no declaration of intent, no written project. No trace at all remains on paper. There is no site report extant. All that remains is the stone with these scored marks characteristic of the 11th century, and these occasional symbols known as mason's marks, from which the foreman could note who had done what. In the Christian religion, there are no edicts laying down architectural rules for building churches. In theory, anywhere will do so long as it is properly consecrated by a prelate who sprinkles the altar and the walls with water mixed with wine and salt and ash. Failing regulations, there is a tradition that goes back to the first Christian churches during the Roman Empire. In the West, the traditional plan comprises the main part, the nave, crossed by a second space, the transept, and ending in a curved area, the apse or chevet. This is known as a Latin cross plan. Where the nave and transept cross, there is a large tower. 2 more towers frame the façade. The churches are always built on an east-west axis, the apse at the eastern end and the façade at the western end. At Conques, where this plan was scrupulously observed, only the towers are not original. The central tower was rebuilt in the 15th century. Those either side of the entrance were destroyed during the wars of religion and restored in the 19th century, faithfully restored, it is thought. The towers served as signals. Visible from far away, they showed the way to pilgrims and asserted the building's monumentality. The great tympanum over the main entrance to the church also addressed the pilgrims. With its 124 figures surrounding Christ in majesty, it shows at one and the same time the promise of salvation, the torments of hell, and the magnificence of the new building. On the south side of the transept is a more discreet entrance that was reserved for the use of the monks. Several other doors along the south side of the nave once connected the church to the monastery buildings, which no longer exist. From the outside, the church seems to fold in on itself, walled like a fortress. Once inside, it is surprising how airy and light it is, combining the monumentality inherited from antiquity and the desire to build high a vertical exaltation that is specific to Christian architecture, but which is emphasized here by the narrowness of the nave due to the constriction of the site. The nave and the transept are structured by large pillars that divide them into three distinct parts. In the centre is a principal space between two lower and narrower areas, the aisles. This plan was borrowed from the Basilica, a Roman civil building that served both as a hall of justice and as a meeting place. The church was first defined as a public building, not the dwelling place of a god as in a pagan temple, but a place where the faithful might assemble to celebrate their religion. The Roman heritage can also be found in the art of building practiced by 11th century master masons. The 14 pillars in the nave and transept that bear a large part of the load of the edifice are made from great blocks of perfectly cut stone, composed so as to ensure solidity. But at the same time they were looking for new ways. So they chose to alternate simple orthogonal pillars with pillars made up of half columns set against a regular core for a richer, more complex appearance. There is no constructional reason for this alternation, just the pleasure of innovation, creating a new combination, setting a new rhythm. The plan also relies on a modular principle. The pillars define the basic module, called a bay, which when repeated identically, sets out a space on a large scale. The builders of Conques were inspired by the desire to surpass themselves. Architectural prowess is an act of faith here. The vaulting of the central nave reaches 22 metres 10 centimetres above the floor, an exceptional height for that time. It is a barrel vault built in stone and a symbol of architectural nobility that, in major churches in the 11th century, replaced the wooden roof structures and flat ceilings used until then. The principle was not new, but the problems associated with its systematic use was to give rise to a different, more skilled, more articulate architecture. For the weight of this stone vaulting is overwhelming. To prevent it from collapsing, the supporting structure had to be reinforced, and the higher it rose, the more fragile it became. The barrel vault is consolidated by a series of transverse arches resting on the solid pillars of the nave. These pillars support the essential vertical pressure of the vaulting. But there is also a very strong lateral pressure that has to be counterbalanced, buttressed. This is the role played to some extent by the aisles that shoulder the pillars each side of the central nave. but the aisles are not sufficient to stabilise the structure. A second level of buttressing is created above which is called the rood loft. In other later Romanesque churches, the rood loft would be open to the faithful, increasing the capacity of the church at peak times. But at Conques, when this contrivance first appeared, access to the rood lofts was so impractical that they were probably never intended for public use. However imposing they might be, they are only there to hold the building up. A final element was put in place to strengthen the whole. Massive masonry buttresses strengthened the outside walls of the church. Thus upheld, the structure is at last ready to take the weight of the vaulting and the roof above it. Pillars, arches, aisles, rood lofts and vaulting together form a rational system, repeated bay after bay to allow the building to go higher and gain more light. In the aisles, the barrel vaulting gives way to another sort of vaulting, groined vaulting, that distributes the load more equally on the pillars, sparing the walls and making it possible to have larger windows. This is one of the essential challenges in a building of this size that is lit by daylight alone, diffused through modern windows designed for Conques by the painter Pierre Soulages. When looking at the church, it's almost impossible to believe that nearly a century separated the beginning and the end of the building work. Only the holes left by the scaffolding poles and the changes in materials give a clue to the fits and starts of a building site that lasted over several generations. The dressed stone, brought with great difficulty from quarries from 10 to 20 kilometres away, was greyish-red to start with, then in a later phase was yellow limestone. The hammered rubble infill material used was schist, first green, then grey. These materials are left on view, a sort of constructive sincerity. Decorative facing is reduced to a minimum. They were content to enhance the central nave and its vaulting. The architectural vocabulary of the vaulting, the arches and the round arch tops of the windows belong to a tradition that goes back to antiquity, even though here it is charged with mystic connotations through the analogy with the celestial vault and the divine presence. Something else new at Conques and in the other great Romanesque churches is the appearance of the human figure in the sculpted capitals that until then had displayed only vegetable or geometric motifs. They first appeared rather shyly as part of an ornamental motif, then in their own right taking up the whole of the capital, like this flight of Saint Peter. What is doubtless the most surprising for us with our sense of theatre is the position of these sculpted figures lost in the heights of the nave. It is almost impossible to decipher them, and even more impossible to appreciate the details unless they can be seen from 9 meters above the ground. The arrest of Sainte Foy, the patron of the church. The capitals were sculpted at ground level. The direction of their gaze, hardly at all downwards, takes almost no account of the height of the place reserved for them. And yet from their heads that support the abacus of the capital to their feet that stick out over the necking, as if the sculptor wanted to flaunt the framework, the saint and those around her are totally integrated with the architecture. The sculptures belong to the capital, emphasizing the importance of its role. They have no existence apart from it, but at the same time, they have no need to be seen by others in order to exist. Christ representing the communion bread and the wine in 2 chalices. The sculpted decor is systematically subjugated to the architectural structure. This figure is the only exception. It is a demonic mask fixed on the north side of the nave and faced from the south side by this benevolent figure. It is probably a trace of an ancient tradition, just like this other personage, whose presence in a church is just as enigmatic. Alexander the Great carried up to heaven by 2 griffins. When children prepare to play hopscotch, they may not know that they are tracing the traditional plan of a Romanesque church with its nave, transept and its crossing. The architecture has to be even stronger at the crossing to support the weight of the tower and the cupola inside. The tower and cupola were rebuilt in the 15th century after the original Romanesque cupola fell in. Only the pillars that supported it remain, 4 pillars each made in one piece that nowadays frame the altar at ground level at the focal point of the ritual of the Mass. But in Romanesque times, the altar, the most sacred part of the church, was placed further back. In the French version of hopscotch, this is called heaven, because it has the shape of the celestial vault as well as being the final objective in the game. Heaven is the apse in the church, all that part situated beyond the transept. That is where the work started, as was the custom in Romanesque times. They built on the site of a former church that was progressively replaced by the new one. Starting at the apse, which housed the altar, was meant to ensure the continuity of their religion. It was the start of a major work. They had the energy, the money, and the ambition, which led them to an overdose of refinement in the choice of materials and treatments. That explains the prodigality of the apsidal decoration compared with the baldness of the rest of the building that was built later when times were hard and savings had to be made. It is also the place for architectural innovation. Its composition becomes complex. The spaces multiply in answer to requirements for new functions. In the larger Romanesque churches, small chapels were built on the perimeter of the apse. At Conques, there are 3 in the apse and 4 in the transept. That is rather too many for the size of the apse. This proliferation makes for an uneasy transition from the chapels in the apse to those in the transept. They tried to solve this by a skew and a window that doesn't correspond to anything. Further proof of the importance accorded to the appearance of this end of the church. Each chapel is dedicated to a different saint and made it possible for wealthier people to celebrate private masses and for pilgrims to make their devotions. A diversification of the offer, as we might say today, which shows the growing importance of the church at all levels of society. In the largest chapel, dedicated to St. Peter, a 16th century altarpiece sits beside the oldest capitals in Conques that deliberately take up the archaic vegetable motifs to perpetuate the memory of the former building and thus mark the continuity of the church from one building to the next. The chapels form a crown around the apse. In principle, the apse is merely the end of the nave, but in a pilgrim church things are more complicated. It is divided in two, the ambulatory reserved for the pilgrims and the apse reserved for the monks alone. The apse is a sanctuary within a sanctuary, a place apart where a less rational system prevails, with superimposed levels ornamented with columns, each different from the other as in ancient edifices. The statue enclosing the relics of the saint was enthroned on a golden altar. The sacred and the practical. On the other side of the grilles is the most original area found in the main Romanesque pilgrim churches, the ambulatory, a simple half-circle around the apse. Open to the pilgrims, it allows them to see the statue of the saint whose help they have come to beseech. This walk for the people makes it possible to channel religious fervour, protect the crowd, and hold services without hindrance. Although the whole church is supposed to be open to all, here the frontier between the worlds of the pilgrims and the monks is quite brutally marked. On top of the iron grilles are sharp spikes cutting off the area of the apse and the choir. They say they were forged from the chains of prisoners freed thanks to the miraculous intervention of the saint, and that they form a barrier both material and mystic. Mystic maybe, material certainly. Behind the grille is Sainte Foy in majesty. That is how they refer to the statue that is covered with gold and inlaid with precious stones and contains the top of the 12-year-old martyr's skull. The head of the statue is probably that of a Gallo-Roman god, but never mind. She gave Whitbard back his eyes that had been gouged out, resuscitated a dead mule, helped a monk to find his lost psalter, restored the hair of a bald knight, delivered a pilgrim from the hands of the Saracens, gave a hammer to a prisoner so that he could break his chains. These are just a few of the miracles she accomplished. Then the saint went out of fashion, and the Abbey of Conques, penalised by being out of the way, fell into decline. Now the statue is a museum piece, returned to its display case after its annual procession. As to the church that was built to house it, and then became too unimportant to be rebuilt to the taste of successive periods, it stayed just as it was, or very nearly. Strange beasts on the tympanum continue to roast a poor hunter, while demons chew on crowned heads and hang misers. On one side is the chaotic swarm of the infernal powers. On the other is the serene and orderly world of Christian religion, an arcaded heaven, protected by the architecture itself, with its arches, pillars and capitals. Architecture occupies a particular place here, midway between heaven and hell, like these two towers that above the patriarch Abraham symbolize a heavenly Jerusalem, the city of God, of which the whole church strives to be a replica.